Sometimes the greatest talents live quietly, hidden behind simple smiles and unnoticed by the world rushing past them. Sometimes it takes a single moment, a harsh word, a mocking laugh, to tear down the wall behind which true brilliance waits. Have you ever seen someone so ordinary that you looked away without a second thought? Have you ever judged a person by how they looked, only to realize later that you had stood in the presence of greatness without even knowing it? This is not a story about fame or polished perfection. This is not a story about standing ovations or sparkling stages. It is a story about a moment when everything changed, in a quiet room filled with laughter that was meant to belittle, not to celebrate. Imagine a woman, dressed in plain clothes, her hair loosely tied, her shoes worn from years of simple living. Imagine her sitting silently at the corner of a busy restaurant, her hands folded, her eyes downcast, invisible to those around her. Now imagine someone pointing at her, laughing, daring her to touch the grand piano in the corner, not in admiration, but in mockery. Imagine the room filled with snickers, the clinking of glasses, the rustling of menus, the slow, sharp drip of judgment falling all around her. What they did not know was that within her lived a storm of melodies, a lifetime of music built not from lessons, not from luxury, but from pure, raw feeling. And when her fingers finally touched those ivory keys, the air itself changed. The laughter stopped. The noise died. And every soul in that room would remember, for the rest of their lives, what it felt like to watch an invisible woman become unforgettable. This is the story of Claire, and it all began with a dare, a moment meant to shame her, that instead set her spirit free. The restaurant was alive with noise and movement, a patchwork of clinking glasses, warm laughter, and the soft hum of conversation blending into a familiar evening rhythm. It was a place where birthdays were celebrated with balloons tied to chairs, where anniversaries were toasted with crystal flutes, and where success was measured by the volume of laughter echoing off the stone walls. In the farthest corner, tucked near the grand piano that no one seemed to notice anymore, sat Claire. She wore a simple gray sweater and faded jeans, her hands resting quietly on her lap. She was not dressed for attention. She had not come here to be noticed. She had come for a quiet meal, a small escape from the heavy world she often carried alone. The piano near her, once a centerpiece of the restaurant's charm, stood silent and untouched. It gleamed under the soft lights, its keys longing for life, but gathering nothing more than dust. Across the room, a group of well-dressed diners laughed a little louder than the rest. They were young, full of an energy sharpened by too much wine and too little wisdom. One of them, a man with a slick haircut and a voice that carried too easily, leaned back in his chair and noticed Claire sitting near the piano. "Hey," he called out, loud enough for half the restaurant to hear. His friends snickered, sensing his attention shifting. "You look like you know your way around that thing." Claire looked up slowly, confusion flickering across her face. "Go on," the man added, gesturing grandly toward the piano. "Play us a song." The laughter that followed was not kind. It was the kind of laughter that was meant to shrink a person, to remind them of the invisible lines society draws between those who belong and those who do not. Claire lowered her gaze, the familiar sting of embarrassment warming her cheeks. She had not asked for this moment. She had not planned for it. She was simply a woman who had wanted a quiet evening, a warm meal, and maybe the peace of not being seen. The group continued to laugh, their voices rising in a drunken chorus. Another dared her louder this time, tapping a spoon against his glass as if announcing the start of a performance no one truly believed would happen. The restaurant's energy shifted slightly, from casual to curious. Diners turned their heads. Waiters slowed their steps. Even the bartender leaned over the counter, sensing something unusual stirring in the air. Claire sat still, her mind racing. She could feel the weight of every glance, every half-smile, every mocking whisper threading through the room like cold fingers. She had every reason to stay seated, every reason to pretend she had not heard, every reason to let the laughter win. But sometimes the soul grows tired of shrinking. Sometimes silence is not bravery. Sometimes it takes standing up, when every voice expects you to stay small, to finally remember who you are. Claire's hands moved to the arms of her chair, and very slowly, very deliberately, she rose. For a long moment, Claire stood perfectly still. Her hands rested at her sides, her shoulders squared but relaxed. In a room full of noise, her stillness was louder than anything else. The laughter, the clinking glasses, the whispered jokes, all of it pressed against her like a heavy wave. She could feel it in her chest, tight and electric, but she did not let it push her back into her seat. Instead, she took a slow step forward, then another. The diners who had mocked her grew quieter, their amusement flickering into uncertainty. A few exchanged glances, as if unsure whether they should keep laughing or prepare for something else. Across the room, more heads turned. Forks paused midair. Conversations stumbled into silence. Claire's footsteps were soft against the wooden floor, but they sounded impossibly loud in the growing hush. When she reached the grand piano, she paused. Her hand hovered above the polished surface for a heartbeat, then another, before she pulled out the heavy wooden bench. It scraped softly against the floor. The sound felt like a curtain being pulled back before a performance no one had truly expected to see. Claire sat down, her back straight, her fingers trembling just slightly as they hovered over the untouched keys. She took a slow breath, letting it fill every corner of her chest before releasing it just as slowly. For a moment, she did nothing. The restaurant, once buzzing and bright, now held its breath. The man who had first jeered leaned forward, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, ready to laugh again. Some patrons waited in polite discomfort, expecting a clumsy tune, a nervous mistake, a small woman out of her depth. But Claire did not move for applause. She did not move for approval. She closed her eyes, and she remembered. She remembered the tiny apartment where she grew up, where an old battered piano stood against the cracked wall. She remembered small fingers pressing uncertainly against chipped keys, the way her mother's voice had filled the air with encouragement, even when their world had very little else to offer. She remembered nights when music was the only thing that kept the darkness from settling too deep inside her. It had never been about performance. It had never been about fame. It had been about survival, about hope stitched into melodies when everything else had been broken. Her fingers settled onto the keys, light, almost unsure at first, and then, with a breath as natural as her own heartbeat, she began to play. The first notes were soft, like a whisper sliding through the tense air. They wound their way through the restaurant, touching each table, brushing against each ear, scattering the last remnants of laughter like dry leaves in the wind. Heads turned fully now. Conversations stopped altogether. People listened, truly listened, because within the simple touch of her hands there was something pure, something aching and beautiful that no one in that room could have prepared for. Claire was not here to impress them. She was here to remind them that greatness often hides where no one dares to look. The music grew, blooming from the fragile first notes into a melody that filled every inch of the restaurant. It was not loud, it was not forceful, it did not need to be. Claire's fingers moved with a grace that was almost unnatural, each note flowing into the next like drops of rain sliding down a window pane. There was a sadness there, a tenderness so raw and honest that it pulled at something deep inside every person who heard it. The man who had mocked her sat frozen, the smirk wiped clean from his face. His hands, once tapping impatiently against the table, now lay still. His friends, who had once laughed loudly, leaned forward in their chairs, their wine glasses forgotten, their conversations lost in the growing hush. Across the room, a couple celebrating an anniversary reached for each other's hands, their fingers intertwining silently as the music wrapped around them. Near the bar, an elderly man lowered his newspaper slowly, his eyes glistening as forgotten memories stirred awake within him. The waiters stood motionless at their stations, watching, listening, feeling the weight of something they could not quite explain but dared not interrupt. Claire sat at the piano like she belonged there, not as a performer, but as a messenger. Her music spoke the words she never had. It spoke of longing, of dreams buried under years of simple living, of beauty found in quiet places. There was no sheet music in front of her, no conductor waving a baton, no grand stage or blinding spotlight. There was only a woman and a piano, and the truth that flowed between them, pouring freely into a room that had once judged her unworthy. And as she played, something shifted inside the hearts of those who watched. Regret crept into the eyes of those who had laughed first. Embarrassment colored the cheeks of those who had whispered cruelly behind their menus. The heavy walls of judgment, built so carelessly with glances and assumptions, began to crack, because in that moment it became impossible to see Claire as anything less than extraordinary. Every delicate rise and fall of the melody told a story they had never taken the time to hear, the story of resilience, of passion hidden behind modest smiles, of a soul that had refused to shrink even when the world tried to fold it away. Claire's hands moved faster now, weaving joy into the sorrow, hope into the sadness. Her eyes remained closed, lost in the world only she could see, and yet she was giving a piece of it to everyone there, a silent gift offered without expectation. The final notes of her song floated upward, lingering like a prayer whispered against the ceiling. Then, at last, they faded into the silence. For a moment no one breathed. And then, as if drawn by an invisible hand, the entire restaurant rose to its feet. Chairs scraped against the floor. Hands clapped together, hesitant at first, then stronger, louder, rising into a thunderous ovation that shook the walls. But Claire did not stand to bow. She simply smiled, a small, knowing smile, and gently closed the lid over the keys. She had not played for applause. She had played because her heart had something to say, and now, finally, they had heard it. The clapping echoed through the restaurant long after Claire's hands had left the keys. People stood frozen in the moment, unsure how to return to their meals, their conversations, their small celebrations. It was as if something sacred had passed through them, something too fragile to disturb. Slowly, tentatively, a few people began to move. The elderly man near the bar was the first. He shuffled forward, his cane tapping lightly against the wooden floor. His eyes were bright, rimmed with tears he made no effort to hide. When he reached Claire, he removed his worn cap and pressed it against his chest. "That," he said in a voice thick with emotion, "was the most beautiful thing I have heard in 50 years. Claire met his gaze with a soft smile, her own heart full beyond words. She nodded, accepting his gratitude not as a trophy, but as a shared moment between two souls who understood the language of feeling. Behind him, others followed. The couple who had held hands during her playing stepped forward. The woman, elegant and poised moments ago, now wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. She reached out, hesitated, then gently touched Claire's shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered, "for reminding us what love sounds like." Even the group who had mocked her in the beginning stood awkwardly near the piano now. Their laughter was gone, replaced by something heavier, something real. The man who had dared her spoke, his voice low and rough around the edges. "I am sorry," he said, the words breaking the heavy air. "We were wrong." Claire did not gloat. She did not revel in their shame. She simply nodded again, her forgiveness as quiet and natural as her music had been. A waiter approached next, a young woman with bright eyes and trembling hands. She carried no tray, no bill, only a single white rose, plucked hastily from the vase at the bar. She offered it wordlessly, her face shining with something that needed no explanation. Claire accepted the rose, holding it gently, as if it might shatter. Around her, the restaurant shifted, not in noise or movement, but in atmosphere. It was as if every person who had witnessed her performance now carried a piece of it inside them, a small, silent reminder to look deeper, to listen harder, to feel more openly. The owner of the restaurant, a man who rarely left the kitchen, emerged from the back, wiping his hands on a clean white towel. He walked straight to Claire, his face serious but his eyes kind. "You have given us a gift tonight," he said. "The piano is yours to play any time you wish." Claire smiled once more, humbled by the kindness now blooming in the space that had once held only judgment. She placed the white rose gently atop the piano and stood up, her heart lighter than it had been in years. Without a word, she returned to her small table, where her meal sat untouched and now cold. But it did not matter. Something far greater had been fed that night, not just in her, but in everyone who had heard her soul speak through the keys. As the night deepened, the restaurant slowly returned to its gentle rhythm, but something in the air had changed. Conversations became softer, laughter grew warmer, and even the clinking of glasses seemed to carry a different kind of music. A music that had nothing to do with notes and everything to do with hearts quietly learning to see again. Long speeches. She had never needed recognition. Her music was never meant to prove anything. It was simply a part of her, a part she had kept quietly lit, like a lantern tucked against her chest, through years of living a life unnoticed. As she stood to leave, the same group that had mocked her Rose F. Claire finished her meal in peace, her spirit calm and full. She did not need congratulations or rom their seats. They stepped aside, clearing her path with silent respect, their heads slightly bowed. They offered no more words because sometimes true apologies are not spoken. They are lived in changed actions. Claire passed them without anger, without pride. She smiled, not because she had won something, but because something softer and deeper had bloomed in their hearts. And that was enough. Outside, the night was cool and crisp. The stars hung low and bright, like 100 open windows spilling light onto the quiet world below. Claire pulled her sweater tighter around her and began walking down the street, her footsteps soft against the sleeping city. Behind her, the restaurant doors swung open briefly, releasing a final wave of warmth and the faint lingering echo of music that would stay long after the lights were turned off. As she walked, memories wrapped themselves gently around her, memories of long-ago evenings, sitting at the broken piano in her childhood home, teaching herself to play by ear, because sheet music had been a luxury they could never afford. No one had trained her fingers to move the way they did. No one had paid for lessons or praised her practice. Her music had grown wild and free, shaped by joy and sorrow, by hope and heartbreak. It had grown strong in the shadows. It had survived without applause. And tonight it had finally been seen, not because it had changed, but because the world around it had opened its eyes, even if just for a little while. Claire paused at a corner, glancing back once at the glowing restaurant windows. She smiled again, the same small, knowing smile she had worn at the piano, and then turned away, disappearing into the quiet embrace of the night. Because true talent does not need to chase recognition. It does not need grand stages or shining trophies. True talent lives quietly, steadily, waiting only for the right moment to remind the world that beauty, once set free, can change everything. And sometimes, all it takes is one brave soul willing to play the first note.